Ladies and gentlemen, what you are about to hear isn't just another political spat. It's the kind of live television moment that flips the script and leaves an audience stunned into silence. If you enjoy stories where arrogance meets reality and confidence crumbles in seconds, make sure you smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below about who you think truly won this clash. Because trust me, you'll want to have your say when this is over. Now let's dive in. The studio that night was charged like a storm cloud ready to break. A crowd of spectators, producers, and camera operators knew they weren't here for some dry policy talk. They were here because two very different women were about to collide on live television. On one side of the table sat Rosie O'Donnell, the comedian, the provocateur, the talk show veteran who had built her reputation on wit, sarcasm, and pushing buttons. Rosie thrived in tension, and she was leaning back in her chair with that unmistakable smirk, eyes twinkling like she already had her first punchline loaded. Across from her sat Karoline Leavitt, younger, polished but not naive. She had been in the political spotlight before, and she understood exactly how these games were played. Upright posture, hands folded neatly, her gaze fixed on the moderator but never straying far from Rosie. She didn't need to smirk. She didn't need to roll her eyes. Her strength was in composure, and it was that composure that would soon become the weapon no one saw coming. The moderator did his best to open with civility, framing the night's discussion around the role of family in modern politics. But let's be honest, no one in that studio thought Rosie O'Donnell would keep it strictly about policy. This was her arena, her crowd, and she had come not to debate, but to dominate. And within moments, the polite facade cracked. Rosie leaned forward, her voice dripping with charm that was as sharp as it was sarcastic. "You know, it's easy to preach about American family values," she said, pausing just long enough for the cameras to tighten on her face, "when your marriage looks like a Stepford fantasy made for Fox News clips." The audience burst into laughter, some genuine, some nervous, but loud enough to ripple across the studio like a spark through dry grass. The jab wasn't subtle. It wasn't clever policy critique. It was a direct shot at Karoline's marriage, a dig designed not to enlighten, but to humiliate. Rosie basked in the sound, leaning back like she just delivered a knockout. But then the camera panned to Karoline. No laugh. No fluster, just a clenched jaw, steady eyes, and a hand that rose calmly, deliberately, to signal that she was ready to respond. The moderator tried to step in, but Karoline wasn't about to let the moment slide. And here is where everything changed. "Rosie, you just crossed a line, and I'm going to show you exactly why that was a mistake." The studio fell silent. Producers leaned forward in their booths, suddenly realizing the dynamic had shifted. Rosie smirked again, trying to mask the flicker of unease crossing her face, but Karoline didn't blink. She sat still, letting that silence grow heavier, letting Rosie's words hang in the air like smoke before a storm. This wasn't the start of a debate. The debate was already over, and only one of them knew it. The air inside the studio had shifted. Just moments before, the audience had been laughing along with Rosie, some even clapping at her trademark sarcasm. But when Karoline raised her hand and spoke with that calm authority, the mood turned. It wasn't silence born of boredom. It was silence heavy with anticipation, the kind that settles over a crowd when they know something unforgettable is about to happen. Karoline leaned forward slightly, her fingers pressed flat against the table. She didn't shout. She didn't let emotion control her. Instead, her voice dropped into that measured, deliberate cadence that commands attention without demanding it. "Rosie," she said evenly, "you can take shots at me all day long. That's politics. But you don't know my husband. You don't know my marriage. And when you mock him, you're not exposing me, you're exposing yourself." The words landed like stones thrown into a still pond. The laughter was gone. No applause followed, just silence, as though everyone in the room, even the cameras themselves, leaned closer to hear what would come next. Rosie shifted in her seat, her smirk faltering for the first time, and that subtle twitch of discomfort was all the confirmation the audience needed. Karoline had struck a nerve. Her tone sharpened, but never rose. My husband isn't a punchline. He's a combat veteran. He's a father. He's the man who stood by me when half this country told me I didn't belong here. He earned respect the hard way, by sacrifice, by service. And the fact that you think that's something to laugh at says more about you than it ever will about him. It was surgical, precise, not a wild swing, but a scalpel cutting directly into the weakness behind Rosie's attack. The smirk was gone now, replaced with a defensive smile that looked brittle, forced. Rosie's eyes darted toward the moderator, almost as if searching for a lifeline, but none came. The studio was transfixed. The producers, who had expected just another messy exchange of insults, now found themselves witnessing something entirely different, a reversal of power unfolding in real time. Rosie had gone for comedy, Karoline had gone for truth, and the truth was winning. For a moment, Rosie tried to interject, opening her mouth to recover her ground, but Karoline lifted her hand, calm, controlled, authoritative. "No, let me finish," she said, never breaking her steady tone. And that was the moment the tide fully turned. What began as Rosie's stage was no longer hers. Karoline had seized the room, not with volume, not with anger, but with composure. The battle had started, and Rosie O'Donnell was already on the defensive.
The silence in the studio wasn't empty anymore. It was charged, alive, pulsing with expectation. Karoline's words had cut through the noise like a blade, and now every eye was fixed on her. Rosie, who had walked into the broadcast confident and smirking, suddenly looked smaller in her chair. Her arms folded, then unfolded. Her trademark grin flickered, not from triumph, but from discomfort. Karoline didn't move quickly. She didn't need to. Her stillness was its own kind of power. When she leaned forward again, her voice steady, the audience instinctively leaned with her. "You see, Rosie," she began, her gaze locked tight on her opponent, "you've made a career out of ridicule. You treat mockery as if it were some kind of moral currency, as if putting someone down makes your opinion more valuable. But I was raised to measure people by how they handle adversity, not how loudly they laugh at others from a safe seat in the studio." That landed. A few gasps echoed from the front rows. A camera caught Rosie shifting, her lips pursing as though she had a retort, but no words came. Karoline's delivery wasn't angry, but it was piercing, surgical in its accuracy. "My husband doesn't sit on panels throwing zingers. He doesn't mock strangers for applause. He spent years overseas, serving this country, watching his brothers come home with wounds you'll never see, and burying friends who will never hear your jokes. And yet here you sit, reducing him to a punchline. That isn't comedy, that's cowardice." The crowd reacted, not with laughter this time, but with that sharp intake of breath that signals a truth too strong to dismiss. Rosie tried to laugh, a brittle sound that fell flat. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for support that wasn't there. Karoline pressed on, her tone unshaken. "You thought you were clever because you mocked someone you don't even know. But what you revealed was weakness. That when you can't win an argument, you don't debate ideas, you attack families. And let me be very clear, that ends here." For the first time in years, Rosie O'Donnell sat silent under the weight of someone else's words. The woman who had mastered the art of interruption, the queen of the quick comeback, had none. Karoline wasn't just defending her husband anymore. She was dismantling a cultural playbook that Rosie had relied on for decades. And the audience knew it. A single clap broke the tension, then another. Within seconds, the studio erupted into applause, not for Rosie's wit, but for Karoline's composure. The tide had turned, and there was no turning it back. Rosie had walked in with matches, expecting sparks. Karoline had brought the storm, and the storm was only getting stronger.
The roar of applause still echoed in the studio long after Karoline's final words in that exchange. It wasn't the kind of applause meant to fill dead air or smooth over an awkward pause. This was different. It was raw, genuine, and it had the unmistakable sound of an audience realizing they had just witnessed something bigger than television. Rosie, normally in her element, sat stiff. Her smirk was gone, replaced by a thin, brittle smile that barely disguised the tension in her jaw. She fiddled with her microphone, forced out a chuckle, but the chuckle landed with a hollow thud. She looked, for the first time in years on live television, out of her depth. Karoline didn't gloat. She didn't pump her fist or grin at the crowd. She sat composed, almost serene, as if she'd known all along this moment would come. That calm presence only made the contrast sharper. Rosie was rattled, Karoline was unshaken. The audience could feel the balance of power had shifted, and shifted hard. But the impact didn't stop in that studio. Behind the glass of the control room, producers leaned over their consoles, whispering frantically, "Clip that. We need this on socials now." Network executives were already drafting notes, realizing this wasn't just a segment anymore. This was viral lightning. Within minutes of the break, short clips of Karoline's rebuttal began making their way onto Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. And the internet did the rest. A political satire account captioned the exchange, "This wasn't a debate, this was a public schooling." It pulled in 300,000 views in under 15 minutes. Hashtags like Karoline cuts deep and Rosie rattled began trending worldwide. Even accounts that had never mentioned Karoline Leavitt before were now sharing the clip with words like grace, savagery, and a masterclass in restraint. Meanwhile, Rosie's camp scrambled. PR aides rushed to draft statements, some suggesting she apologize, others insisting she lean into the joke. But every draft sounded weak in the face of what had just unfolded. Comedians debated whether to defend her or stay silent, and many chose the latter, unwilling to risk association with a punchline that had so clearly backfired. Karoline's phone, by contrast, exploded with messages. Advisors, donors, supporters, and more importantly, everyday viewers who had felt personally spoken for. A combat widow messaged, "He'd be proud." A teenager from Texas wrote, "I want to be like you when I grow up. Strong, clear, unapologetic." And one woman from Ohio summed it up simply, "You gave me my voice back." It was no longer just a television moment. It was becoming a cultural reckoning. Rosie had mocked. Karoline had answered. And the country was deciding in real time who came out stronger. For Rosie O'Donnell, the damage wasn't just reputational. It was foundational. She had built her career on control, on being the sharpest voice in the room. That night, live for millions to see, control slipped through her fingers. And for Karoline, she had arrived as a guest, but she left as a force.
2 days after the broadcast, the dust hadn't settled. If anything, the firestorm had only grown. Social media feeds across the country were still replaying the moment when Rosie O'Donnell's smirk faltered and Karoline Leavitt seized control of the narrative without ever raising her voice. Clips of the exchange were dissected like championship highlights. Pause, rewind, replay. Commentators called it everything from a cultural turning point to the moment ridicule lost its crown. For Rosie, the silence was deafening. No snappy follow-up, no triumphant social post. Her team scrambled to manage the fallout, weighing whether to spin, apologize, or ignore the moment entirely. In the end, they chose silence, and silence in this case wasn't strength, it was surrender. The once unshakable queen of sharp one-liners now seemed bruised, diminished. Her reputation wasn't gone, but the foundation had cracked. Karoline, on the other hand, didn't chase the spotlight. She didn't post a victory selfie, she didn't fire off a string of triumphant tweets. She did the opposite. She stayed quiet, calm, letting the country do the talking for her. And that restraint, ironically, amplified her presence even more. When you don't have to gloat, it's because you've already won. Then came the call. Sitting in a small cafe reviewing notes for her next forum, Karoline's phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number, a Washington, D.C. area code. She almost ignored it, but something in her gut told her to pick up. "Karoline," the voice said gravelly and direct. "It's Senator Marshall." Her posture straightened immediately. The senator wasn't known for pleasantries. "I watched the Rosie segment. I've seen a lot of political takedowns in my time. But that, whatever that was something else. I want you to speak at the national summit, prime time." The weight of the words sank in. This wasn't just a booking, it was an elevation. Not only had Karoline survived the firestorm, she'd been propelled by it. When the day of the summit came, the air in the Atlanta Convention Center carried the same anticipation as that fateful studio, but heavier, broader. Thousands of people filled the seats. Network cameras crowded the aisles. They weren't just here for policy sound bites. They were here to see the woman who had gone toe-to-toe with Rosie O'Donnell and left unshaken. Karoline walked onto the stage in a dark navy blazer, her hair pulled back, her notes tucked neatly in one hand. She didn't stride quickly or drag her feet. She walked steady, deliberate, the way someone walks when they know exactly where they belong. The applause was immediate, rolling across the hall like a wave. She paused, let it crest, then spoke. 2 weeks ago, she began, her voice clear and composed. I went on national television to talk about education, security, and economic empowerment. Instead, I was told my marriage was a joke. The room hushed. I was expected to laugh it off, to take it as just another jab. But I didn't come into public service to be liked by talk show hosts. I came here to stand for people who were tired of being ridiculed for loving their families, their faith, and their country. The crowd erupted, applause thunderous, but Karoline held her composure, waiting until the room settled again. We live in a culture where mockery has been normalized, where ridicule is treated as power. But real strength doesn't look like tearing others down. Real strength looks like standing your ground without losing your dignity. It looks like refusing to back down when the easy thing would be to stay silent. Every word carried weight. She wasn't just addressing the crowd in Atlanta, she was speaking to every viewer who had watched that viral exchange and felt in some way represented. Mothers who had been mocked for their choices, wives who'd been dismissed as just a spouse, young women told to sit down and smile, veterans' families whose sacrifices had been turned into punchlines. By the time she finished, the room was on its feet, a standing ovation not out of politeness, but conviction. Karoline didn't soak it in. She closed her folder, nodded once, and walked off stage. No grand theatrics, no self-congratulation, just the same quiet strength that had carried her through the storm. Rosie O'Donnell never responded, not on social media, not in interviews, not even with a half-hearted joke. The silence spoke louder than any comeback could, because in truth, there was nothing left to say. Karoline hadn't just defended her husband, she had exposed a cultural fault line, the false belief that mockery equals courage, that ridicule equals strength. And she shattered it, not by shouting louder, but by refusing to bend. Rosie mocked, Karoline stood, and in doing so, she didn't just win an argument, she raised the standard. And that's the story of how Rosie O'Donnell thought she could score a cheap laugh, but instead handed Karoline Leavitt the moment that would define her career. A viral takedown, a cultural reckoning, and a reminder that sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's power. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, drop a comment below on what you think about Karoline's response, and of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story.